Howdy, we're back. Actually, the lights kind of went out. We had a power surge. So if you're wondering what happened with the end of the last video, which was supposed to be the entire video about moment of inertia, that's what happened. Had actually two power surges, tried to reboot, took about 48 minutes to reboot, and then we had to go find the file. So we found that, recovered that, and we're ready to start anew about an hour and 40 minutes later. So here we are. We don't have much to go. We're just finishing up with moment of inertia, but a really important concept that, again, the moment of inertia for either a tennis racket or a golf club or whatever have you is dependent upon the axis in which it's rotating. So if you're rotating, let's say this in the frontal plane again, if you're rotating like that, that's the z-axis. But if you're swinging it like a forehand shot, then the rotation's around the y-axis. And let me show you why that makes a huge difference. So when you compare that old wooden racket that you see on the screen, or this steel racket, and today's titanium racket, around that, so when you're swinging a forehand shot and the racket's in front of you, we'll say that my body or my body's in the frontal plane, even though we're rotating around the y-axis. But in terms of holding that racket out like this, the long axis of the racket itself is going to be basically the z-axis. So we've got a y-axis up, we've got a z-axis that's horizontal out, and the racket, whether it's the old school OG wooden racket or today's new, much better racket, makes a huge difference. So the width of the head spreads the mass, because the strings really don't have much mass. It's basically the frame. So as we spread the frame out, that increases the radius of gyration. So the distance, let's see if I can do something here. Copy and paste that, and then I'm going to throw that around like something like that. And I'm going to make it maybe a different color, like blue here. There we go. So you can see it. And then get rid of this thing so you can, there we go. So this essentially is the radius of gyration. Here's the center of mass. And I'll maybe put it just inside because the strings have a little bit of mass, but not much. So here's the frame. This radius you can see is much, much higher, much longer than we see for the wooden racket, right? And so what does that mean? Well, we have a higher radius of gyration that increases the moment of inertia. Now, this is technically in 2 dimensions because we're around in the z-axis. So if you want to think about the racket itself as being in a plane, that includes the z-axis, then that makes some sense. So as we're looking at it, technically, if we were looking at it, it's around the x-axis. So as we look at this particular plane, which is kind of like a sagittal plane, the sweet spot is actually about the size of the W for Wilson. So I have a Wilson racket too. So you see that right there. The size of the W, that's about the size of the sweet spot. What does that mean? Well, anything in here, in this sweet spot, is going to hit it if it makes contact with the tennis ball pretty straight. And you're also going to get maximum spring out of it because it's going to have a high coefficient of elasticity, especially in that sweet spot. That's absolutely the key. That's going to reduce vibration. You're going to hit a straighter shot. It's going to be faster, etc. So this is Venus Williams, Serena's sister. Maybe you may remember her. Still around, I think. So if we can if we increase the moment of inertia around this z-axis, if you hit it off center, it looks like she's about to hit it off center, that racket is less likely to twist in your hand because we've increased the moment of inertia, right? And we're producing a certain amount of torque. And what that means is that the acceleration to twist in your hand is going to be a lot lower. Let's make this a different color. How about a yellow? Which you probably won't be able to see yellow. What about like a green, sea green or something? Good enough. Okay. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger. There you go. Okay, so as the moment of inertia is elevated because you've increased that sweet spot and distributed the mass farther away from the axis of rotation, therefore, since moment of inertia and angular acceleration are inversely proportional, inversely related, that means the angular acceleration is going way down. It's not going to twist in your hand easily. And I can tell you, if you didn't hit in the sweet spot, which is about the size of maybe a silver dollar, maybe a little bit bigger than that. Wasn't very big. If that thing twisted in your hand, the wooden racket, it would vibrate like crazy. So that's basically the reason we've had this redesign of the equipment in tennis, golf, etc., and in softball and little league, whereas baseball's kept the same equipment for the most part. Some people think the ball is juiced now, maybe, probably not. Probably not very much. Okay, so let's finish up by applying this to something biomechanical yet physiological. So in the long shaft for our bones like femur, tibia, humerus, etc., in these long bones, if you take a cross section of those bones, one of the things you'll notice is that we literally have a ring of ossified bone and then a marrow on the inside. So here's kind of a longitudinal cross section. Here's the long axis. So you have cancellous bone on either end, which adapts pretty fast, but also loses mass fast, like in spaceflight, aging, etc. And you also have, let me see if I can, here we go. That's, I guess, close enough. So there's my long axis. You also have this cortical bone, which forms literally a ring. So there's an endosteal ring on the inside and periosteal ring on the outside. This is a femur bone from a 17-year-old, and you can see the thickness of the bone, and also the fact that the bone mass is distributed around an axis of rotation. So here, this is the radius of gyration. So bones have a moment of inertia. Bone strength is often related to the moment of inertia, which is, you can see again, the product of the mass times the square of this radius of gyration. So this is a tube. It might be the fourth power. For someone who's older, like 83 years of age, you have a reduced mass. The radius of gyration is actually slightly higher. So the moment of inertia isn't super reduced. It might be a little lower. Cancellous bone, not cortical bone like you see here, is actually where we see fractures in the elderly. We don't actually see it that much in cortical bone because the radius of gyration actually increases, even though you can see that that bone is thinned considerably. And then when we look at cancellous bone, oh, we lose a heck of a lot of bone mass, a lot of bone mass. So here's an example of three bones, and this happens during development. In children, the bone marrow is usually filled with red marrow, so it produces red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, etc. In adults, it's usually yellow marrow in long bones, and that's mostly fat, if you're wondering. But during development, we see an increase in the amount of mass. So here in this example, I think they don't have an increase in mass. They're just demonstrating that if you have an equal amount of bone, but you distribute bone away from the axis of rotation, that increases the moment of inertia and therefore increases the bending strength. So in this case, because it's a tube, you actually use a little more complicated formula than ours. So it's probably an approximation like that. There we go. So since it's an approximation, I've got to use, I guess I'll use an alpha. Okay, kind of proportional. So strength of the shaft of a bone, which is made of cortical bone, is often related to its moment of inertia. So moment of inertia, again, is resistance against torque. It's a resistance against bending forces, sometimes even shear forces, but bending forces for sure. Okay, well, that's going to do it for our moment of inertia lecture, or at least part 2 of the lecture. Want you guys to have good preparation in terms of exam number 1. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to post these up really soon. Okay, have a good one. We will see you soon.